Hi, Allison.
Hi, Mary-Kay.
Thank you so much for being here, here in Zoom.
Yeah.
Very excited for this opportunity to talk to you a bit about your painting Snare from 2015. I first encountered the painting when it was at your exhibition at Susan Inglett Gallery, Allison Miller Speeds, which was back in late 2015. And I was very pleased to be able to add it to the collection that next year in 2016. And it's a large painting. It's 73 inches tall by 68 inches across. And I am so pleased to be able to show it when I can in our modern and contemporary galleries. And I'm glad to be able to have a little bit of time with you to talk to you about it. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be part of your collection. So.
Great. So I can see that you're in your studio in Los Angeles, and it looks like there's some works on paper maybe on the wall behind you. Are those all recent works that have been made during this quarantine period?
They are over the past probably a month and a half, 2 months. I started making numbers and letters that were cutouts and placing them around plants, hanging them from plants, leaning them against plants, and just taking them sort of out of sort of normal context we would see these things in, and thinking about in recontextualizing something as obviously linguistic as a letter or a number, what kind of meaning that would have in this new context. Or would it become a drawing, just a drawing, just a shape? I was also interested in the paper itself. Once it was leaning against plants, would essentially be able to stand on its own or sort of magically hang. And so these thin, light pieces of paper then also became, in a sense, sculptures that seem to sort of defy gravity sometimes. So both a drawing and a sculpture with maybe a sort of understood meaning upon approach that then gets a bit slippery once you see it in that new context. And eventually, after taking photos of those letters and numbers, I brought them into the studio and started making drawings that I knew would incorporate the letters and numbers collaged onto the paper. And I was interested in making drawings that both materially, a lot of the color you see in them is oil stick. So it's very sort of thick, viscous, sort of meaty color that is covering thin pieces of paper, which I think is a really kind of gross, interesting combination. Some of it is watercolor as well, but then to incorporate that with the collage and see if no one element could dominate the drawing. If even though we have very graphic, very large to the page letter or number, that we, in this context, is some kind of representation in a sense. That they still would not actually dominate the drawings. They would just take their place among other elements. And as I am always interested in, even with the paintings, that just to see what happens if the priority is not so evident, is not so obvious. And I don't make drawings as plans for paintings, but they inevitably speak to the paintings that I end up making after I make the drawings. And, you know, when I first started painting, I was really interested in the different kind of energy a lot of people, including myself, approach drawings versus paintings, that I think we give ourselves a lot more sort of freedom and flexibility, maybe more of an experimental feeling when we approach approach drawings. And I could feel myself tensing up as I approached a canvas, and whether that was scale or the money of the that it costs, or the history of it. But for whatever reason, I wanted to approach paintings consciously with the headspace of drawing. So to stay experimental, to stay flexible. And so when I was making paintings at that point, I decided I wasn't going to make drawings because I sort of wanted all of the energy to go into the paintings themselves, in some maybe sort of younger idea that we have this finite amount of energy or something. I wanted to sort of conserve my energy for the paintings. But I knew, again, I wanted to think of the paintings themselves at that point as drawings of the paintings or paintings of the drawings, that they could have a sort of overt relationship to that kind of experimentation. So I'm sure these drawings will have a relationship to the paintings I make next, but I'm not sure in what way. I sort of look forward to seeing what happens. But yeah, these are what I've been making most recently.
Thanks. It's fascinating to hear your relationship between your works on paper and your painting. And I do think I've heard a lot of artists say that immediacy of drawing is something they try to retain when they get to the painting stage as well. So that's interesting. So the next question has to do with what or who are some of your influences that you find yourself coming back to over and over?
Yeah, I find myself going in and out of phases with different artists, probably like most people. And sometimes I can see a direct relationship between who I'm looking at and what I'm making. Sometimes it's not as direct, or it takes a while to sort of be processed. I think of it almost as processing it in my body, and it coming out in the objects I'm making. But someone that was really important to me for my last body of work that is still in my head is John Wesley, who, while I find some of his work can be problematic, which may be a different conversation, I think it's an interesting conversation. But what I take from his work personally that I find really compelling is that his work is extremely graphic. It feels very cold in terms of there's no paint strokes. It almost has a more, in a way, it has a very direct relationship to graphic design in a funny way. But the content itself and the narrative itself, which sometimes is actually hard to even articulate, is so visceral and so complex that I find that the coldness of the graphic nature of the paintings almost is in contradiction to what the paintings ostensibly are about, and which has to do with style, and thinking about even style as being maybe the tone of voice that something is said in, which I think is helpful to me to think about in a way. But so that contradiction I find very interesting. And my last body of work had a bit more intense, somewhat autobiographical content to the work that I could feel as that content got more personal, the paintings themselves got more graphic and a little colder. And I certainly think Snare is recent enough that it was also sort of, it shares that sensibility that can you have this kind of colder language that is still saying something very nuanced and complex that is not actually, the nature of the content is not graphic, so to speak. Some of the other artists I've been looking at a lot are, Sam Gilliam has been a really big one for me for a few years now. And a lot of that is because he worked in a few different sort of formats, per se, all painting, but each of these different formats, whether it's a sort of strung up, sort of festooned canvas or shaped stretched canvas, or more sort of object-like, heavily impastoed paintings, they all, to me at least, collapse the idea of sculpture and painting, object, gesture, and shape. And all of those things I find are in such intense conversation with each other that they make this kind of almost hybrid object that that I still think of as paintings, but have these other sort of elements to them that make that, that complicate that, which I find interesting. Mary Heilman is always a big one for me. And she, I think, has the supreme ability to do something that looks very simple, but actually is incredibly complicated and complex. And the paintings, again, they seem simple, but are actually hard as nails. They are incredibly tough paintings. And I have always enjoyed, seeing her work. She's always in my mind. She seems to be able to pull that magic trick off seamlessly, which is incredible. Robert Colescott is another person that, I'm a bit contradictory in my personality. I think my work can be as well. And Colescott is someone who I find interesting for a lot of the same reasons I've been saying, about these other artists, but maybe even more overtly with Colescott, because his subject matter is so intense and so sort of visceral. But so he's, doing figurative paintings that some of them are actually almost historically based. Some of them feel much more personal, but they are these sort of tableaus that you're watching. And even though there's figuration, there's intense interplay between the figures and the paintings. I find myself zoning out on the top corner where there's a puff of smoke, where the way he's chosen to paint the puff of smoke itself makes me sort of question what I'm supposed to be paying attention to in the painting, which I enjoy. I can hold both in my head. I can be sort of taking in the narrative, thinking about the levels of information being given to me through that narrative, all of the thoughts that come with it, and also be looking at how he made the painting, and the decisions that are painting decisions that lie outside of the narrative itself. In fact, actually push against the narrative to some extent because they are so much about painting. So he's somebody that I think about a lot. And then Mike Cloud is also someone that probably in the past year has become more and more interesting to me. And, again, I think he's someone making paintings that take up space like a sculpture. Some of his paintings are actually installed on the ground, leaning against the wall. And they have they're constructed in a sense like a sculpture. They're very physical objects, but then with so much paint on top of them that the paint itself becomes very physical. Just sort of psychically, I think they're very intense objects to see that even their effect in the room feels more active, and I wouldn't say what would I say, more palpable than, say, a painting that is just surface. I mean, these are really objects, which I also think about in terms of my own painting as well, that I never forget that they are objects sitting in space, not just what is on the surface of the canvas. So yeah, so those are some of the people I've been thinking about most recently.
That's great to hear. I love hearing some surprises there that I wouldn't necessarily have expected, like John Wesley and Cole Scott. Really interesting. So it also reminded me of this moment in which we had Snare in our contemporary galleries, and it was juxtaposed with a chevron-shaped canvas by Frank Stella. Yeah. And it was a really interesting conversation, a dialogue between yours and Stella's work. So I wanted to bring up a quote from Stella where he said, "What you see is what you see in painting," suggesting that painting maybe doesn't really support these high ideals that abstract expressionism had, but really just a gesture is a gesture and nothing more. But your work seems to interact or even maybe subvert that attitude by showing that gestures can acquire like a conceptual weight or have a different kind of resonance. For example, in Snare, I know that there are some drips of painting, but then there's some other things that look like drips, but they're trompe l'oeil, and same with some of the gestures. So I'm just wondering if that's suggesting a sort of like materiality of painting, and if you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, and it was so exciting to see that image that you sent me of the two hanging together. You know, because I always want both, even contradictory ideas, to sit next to each other, or more than just those two. You know, I'm not interested in one perspective. I'm not interested in two perspectives. You know, I think having sort of being able to incorporate more than one voice, just even in life, even is necessary. And I'm trying to do the same thing in a static image in a painting. But so I think that idea, that quote of Stella's is absolutely true and not. I think both things can sit next to each other again. And, you know, what that brings me to, in a sense, for me, I guess I end up thinking about all these contradictions that I'm interested in. One of them being, I want the gestalt of the painting to be taken in essentially simultaneously. I'm interested in that as a whole image, and absolutely interested in each element within the painting as well. And both of those things being important. Stella also talked about not reading a painting, right? And I'm also interested in that, which I absolutely believe should and can be done with abstraction as well as any other kind of representation. But so, you know, I find that idea interesting, and I'm not just trying to subvert it, but maybe again have both, hold both. These paintings are vessels that can hold all sorts of things all at one time, just like our minds can. And in terms of the drips, you know, it's, I think when I first started incorporating the drips and then the fake drips, it was a bit tongue-in-cheek. I thought it was sort of funny to do what sometimes is an accident and actually something that you wipe away and try to pretend never happened. And sometimes you want it, you know, to be this this sort of sign of a very physical act. But what happens? Why would one fake it? What happens when you're faking it? And I think it's what I'm trying to have happen, especially if a viewer actually takes the time to slow down and look at things, everything on the canvas, which is the dream. If you actually get to the point where you're seeing the drip and realizing it's a fake drip by where it's sitting or what color it is, or that it's on top of whatever it's on top of, or it just, you can tell it's not the form of a real drip. That when that happens, I'm hoping that the viewer would sort of bounce back through the painting and not questioning its sincerity, because I don't think that is even, I find that a completely uninteresting question to think about, but really questioning intentionality, questioning meaning, questioning how the painting was made. You know, I'm hoping that would maybe start to even reprioritize what you thought was happening in the painting. And I find that moment, if a viewer gets to it, I find that to be the most excitement I feel when I'm looking at a painting that I find interesting is when I have to stop and question my own assumptions about it, which, you know, a lot of what I think about in painting has a real world correlation. And I think that is true of so many things, even related to what's happening today. You know, I'm trying to question my own assumptions while I'm making the painting, and my own intentions while I'm making the painting, and have it sort of built into the painting itself that while I'm questioning it and subverting and contradicting myself, and that I'm trying to make an object I can't predict and I can't necessarily even explain. And that if I feel like that about something that I've made, that could transmit to the viewer. And hopefully that would be an exciting experience that is both, you know, in your mind and maybe even in your body. I do want both of those things as well, that it's an experience, a physical experience to actually navigate through the painting and view it, as well as having to almost do the math of the painting in a funny way. And, you know, the drips themselves now are, in a sense, a move that part of this visual language that I've built in the paintings over the years is one of them that gets sort of pulled out when it needs to in a painting. And so that also then, you know, is it's a slant on the idea of a spontaneous gesture, or even an intuitively made painting. I mean, these are intuitively made, they are incrementally made, but there is a lot of sort of thinking and decision making happening between each move. So it's a lot of sort of conscious choices, trying to almost ironically make an object that I can't really put into language. And I also think, sorry, but I also think it's interesting when how many times do you have to repeat something before it becomes a motif? How many times does something get repeated before it becomes a pattern? Is it 3? Is it 4? You know, when does it cross that line? And also, you know, it's almost like when you repeat a word, it loses its meaning. I mean, once you've done something over and over again, you know, either in a painting or even carrying the same gesture between paintings, having it mean something different each time you use it again. It's just never going to be the same as when it first accidentally happened.
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing me back to the moment that I, you know, saw the exhibition at Susan Inglett Gallery, and really being attracted to this painting in particular, and coming back another time and being drawn by it again. And I think part of that was the big white space in the center, how you can see that there are these sort of brush marks, at least that's what they look like to me, of sort of white on white pattern. And then there's another kind of pattern or sort of line or gesture that comes down the left side of the painting. And it just kept drawing me in. There was something really interesting there that maybe was toying with my immediate sort of notions of what I thought this painting was. So it kept kind of being unpredictable in that way. And that's one of the things that attracted me to it. And also, you know, we really try to encourage our viewers to spend some time do some close looking with works, and that this had such potential for that. So
yeah, even though I think it does, it's hard to talk about one's own work in this way, but I do think it's big enough, and many of the elements on it are big enough that I think it reads as it's a somewhat simple painting, actually, and something that can be understood and in a sense read from across the room. But I always hope that actually closer inspection gives you other layers of understanding and meaning in the paintings, that you're sort of, it's worth your while to investigate, and then step back again and just keep, I mean, that's how I realize I physically engage with works that I like, as I'm doing this constant kind of shuttling back and forth, because it's a different reality when a painting, especially, this isn't a huge painting, but it's big enough that when you stand in front of it, it is, you have to choose where you're going to look, essentially, and you have to stand at a distance to see everything at one time. And I even find that kind of fascinating, because it is a static object, but you are having to move around to see everything.
Yeah, and that, so that brings me to another question that has to do with abstraction itself, and what you see as abstraction's potential for sort of looking at history, or memory, and in a way transmuting those painterly gestures into more of a sign or a motif, as you said, and how this reflects or even maybe critiques other practices of painting.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to think, I don't think I ever intend to, I wouldn't use the word, I guess, critique. I don't know if it, it might be a bit of ribbing at most, but I think abstraction itself, at this point could mean so many different things. Every object, and I always refer to paintings as objects, but I mean paintings, every painting, exists on this continuum and has a relationship to representation and abstraction. And that ratio is sort of different per object, but so I identify as an abstract painter. I like the term. I have no problem with that term. But I just think that like any, category we have, is such a simple name for something that is so nuanced and so broad, right? So in that sense, I think I approach abstraction, consciously thinking of making abstract paintings, because that is how I can approach an object and making an object with the most freedom and flexibility and mutability possible. That's the language that I use to give myself that kind of freedom. And it feels like I've got as much space as I need. I can do anything. These are big sort of vessels that can contain, I think I've said this already, contain really anything. And it's actually funny, it makes me think about there's a painting by an artist named Robert Kushner, who was making really interesting, almost performative paintings in the 70s. He was somebody that was interested in, he was married to a dancer, and he was very interested in Zen Buddhism, and was making these almost tapestry-like paintings, where he was sewing together different pieces of fabric and wearing them in performances, and then after the performance would pin them on the wall and they would become a painting. And one of these was actually included in the pattern decoration show at MoCA just a few months ago that I saw pre-pandemic. And that was the first I'd ever seen in person. It was really exciting. But by the time this painting, Slavic Dances, was made in 1978, I believe he had stopped doing performances and really had shifted to really concentrating on these as paintings. And that he actually, he said that he was interested in what's the toughest thing you could incorporate into a painting that's interested in pattern and decoration. What would make it the hardest to make? And he decided it was the figure. And so he started putting figures into these paintings that became, to my knowledge, I mean, I just can't think of another painting that incorporated all of these different elements at the same time, which is a shaped canvas. I believe it's unstretched piece of canvas. And figuration painted as pattern, figuration painted as cartoon pattern, and color, you know, patterned color. And, you know, it's the kind of a great example of what I think about a lot with a lot of different paintings, which is, you know, there's the ostensible point, and then there's what the painting is of and what the painting is about. And I can tell you what that painting is of, and I can tell you what's in the painting. It is very hard to tell you what that painting is about. And I just thought it was phenomenal. I can't even remember, honestly, how I came upon seeing an image of the painting in a book. But so I was thinking a lot about that. It was around the studio, and you know, the way I generally approach making paintings is I give myself as much freedom as possible up front, and then things sort of ratchet down. So I'm trying to keep them feeling spontaneous, but they're actually, by the end, you know, they've been very thought out and very even edited. And the way I started this painting, I just decided I'm going to have a relatively large canvas, and I'm going to put a pretty big shape. That's the first thing I'm doing, is plunking a big shape down on the canvas. And I decided I was going to actually turn Kushner's Slavic Dances painting on its side, and that would be the shape. And that's how the painting started. You know, the background got dropped in afterwards. The background actually, you know, I was conscious of the fact that there was going to be a survey of Stella's work at the Whitney, coincidentally hanging at the same time as this show. And, you know, especially, you know, early Stella paintings, they look pretty cold in reproduction, but the reality is they're hand painted. They're much more warm. They're much more human. When you see them in person, they feel very different in person, but they're still, in a sense, perfect. I mean, they are perfect objects. And I was thinking about these sort of bands of color, these kind of stripes, and what happens if the lines are imperfect, what happens if things start melting a bit. And that's where sort of the drips came in. And then thinking about, which I had been interested in for a while, thinking about, can you drop almost hints of figuration into a predominantly abstract painting and almost just have the effect of figuration without actually putting a figure in a painting. So, you know, some of the lines on the left side, those kind of wavy lines, became, in a sense, almost like a lock of hair for me. And then we've got the curves. There's on the diagonal in the white stripe are two curved lines that also became, in a sense, eyes for me. And all of this is happening in a pretty controlled way. A lot of the lines are taped, some are drips, some are not, but they were meant to sort of sit next to each other and then just see what happens. If all of these things, you know, the white might dominate at first, but the longer you look at the painting, when you're concentrating on other parts of the painting, the white sort of fades away. So just thinking about what ends up being the point of the painting at the end, and having, you know, having the viewer kind of cycle through it. But so it's funny. I mean, I think Kushner was interested in putting a figure into P&D based work and seeing what happens. And in a sense, I was entertaining the idea of putting figurative elements into an abstract painting and seeing what happens. The other thing I became interested in at this point, which goes back to the drips, is, you know, there's different kinds of figuration. You know, there's portraiture where you're actually thinking about who this person is. There are paintings that use the figure, even Guston, de Chirico, you know. And then there are paintings that feel to me more about being in your body in a way. And I've been thinking a lot about, you know, the interior of one's body, and so the drips started, they became less of a sort of tongue-in-cheek art historical nod and more of a nod to the painting itself, some kind of entropy happening in the painting while you're watching it. And I that kind of circled back to Stella for me in a way, is what happens if the Stella actually starts almost melting or drooling or vomiting, or, you know, you know, thinking about maybe the state of the painting itself is changing while you're looking at it. And then the last thing I'll say about in response to your question is the pencil lines. I ended up thinking about the white shape almost as a hand. And somehow, you know, the closest object I can refer to in how I was thinking of the pencil lines kind of interacting with that shape is brass knuckles. Somehow I was thinking about those being sort of fit onto that shape. So all these different elements are things I was incrementally thinking about as I made the painting, and still wanting this to be a cohesive image and fall apart at the same time. There was an art writer that visited my studio a few years ago that was familiar with my work, and he had a sort of epiphany, and he said, it's like all these different elements in your paintings are people that got trapped in an elevator together. And I said, yes, but they formed a community. And that's something I just think about all the time, because I am not interested in juxtaposition. I'm not interested in abjection. I'm interested in things almost hitting a point of stasis, or even a kind of stalemate where everything, it's a cohesive painting, but just barely, you know, where things do get along, but, and there is a logic to them, but it still holds a feeling of almost uncanniness that I think a lot of those ideas are interesting to approach abstraction with, for me. So.
Thank you. There's just some wonderful, vivid imagery in what you've just said that brings an extra texture to the piece, and yeah, allows a sort of different other ideas to sort of float around when I think about the piece now. So thank you so much for that. It's kind of the closest thing that I've had in a while to an actual studio visit, is to talk to you a little bit about your process.
Me too, actually.
And about this painting in particular. So Allison, thank you so much for taking this time out of your day and away from making art, and to sit here and talk to me about art. And I wish you the best and a lot of luck going forward.
Thank you, Mary-Kay. You too. Such a pleasure, especially in this time. Such a pleasure to. It really feels like I'm almost put back in my body to think about the work again, which is maybe sounds a bit ironic, but that's how it feels. So, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.